Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 22nd of January, 2020, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. Your host today, Mike Robinson, myself, Brian Gerrish. Well, the young are advising the old.
Well, absolutely. So Greta, of course, at Davos, as we mentioned on Monday. Let's be clear, she said, we don't need a low carbon economy. We don't need to lower emissions. Our emissions have to stop and to stay if we are to have a chance to stay below the 1.5 degrees C target. So our emissions have to stop. We've got to stop breathing, Brian, is basically what it's all about.
Right, and this young lady is trained in climate change, and she's trained in economics as well, presumably.
Well, at the age of, what age is she?
16,
17?
Yeah.
Pretty incredible. She said, until we have the technologies that at scale can put our emissions to minus, then we must forget about net zero. We need real zero. So I can't imagine what that means other than no humanity at all. So there you go. That was her position. Well, Mark Carnage was there as well, although impossible to find it on the World Economic Forum website or the YouTube channel. But he was reiterating once again the things that he'd been saying in the run-up to this. That basically, you need to change your position on climate change if you're a business or in your financial sector or else. At the core of the system now, these questions are being asked if you're on the right side or the wrong side. And if you're on the wrong side, what are you going to do about it? So this is his position.
There's no more discussion. It's you're either in or you're out. And if you're out, we're going to deal with you. You will fail.
Yes, you will fail, yes. So this is becoming the question, what's your plan to get to net zero carbon emissions? That will determine where capital is flowing, obviously influenced by public opinion, pressure, and government policy as well. So government policy comes last, public opinion comes first, pressure in the meantime. So, you know, as I say, Mark Carney's contribution wasn't really highlighted terribly strongly on the World Economic Forum website or on the YouTube channel. So I had a look in mainstream media to see what they were saying about it. And there was a little report on the Telegraph, and there was a little report on Yahoo News. But other than that, there was only an interview with him from Bloomberg, because Bloomberg has now set up a green section on its website. And as you can see there, it tells us down the left-hand side how naughty we are being. So, you know, it tells us about carbon emissions. It tells us about, it's a scrolling sidebar at the left there, all colored green. It tells us all about how many billion tons of CO2 we're pushing into the atmosphere. It tells us how many soccer fields of forests that we're cutting down each day, and so on. So it is really good. As you can see, the numbers change. It's fantastic. So I'm really impressed with that. Anyway, so it was doom and gloom at Davos, with, I have to say, one exception, and that was Donald Trump, who, in typical Trumpian styles, I leave it to everybody to decide for themselves what they think about this. But while everybody was saying, you know, the world is ending and we've got to stop breathing, this is what Trump had to say.
It's probably the reason I ran for president more than any other thing, because I couldn't understand why we were losing all of these jobs to other countries at such a rapid rate. And it got worse and worse, and I think it's probably the primary reason that I ran, but there are other reasons also. And to replace with a new system that puts workers before the special interests, and the special interests will do just fine, but the workers come first. This is not a time for pessimism. This is a time for optimism. Fear and doubt is not a good thought process, because this is a time for tremendous hope and joy and optimism and action. But to embrace the possibilities of tomorrow, we must reject the perennial prophets of doom and their predictions of the apocalypse. They are the heirs of yesterday's foolish fortune tellers, and I have them, and you have them, and we all have them. And they want to see us do badly, but we don't let that happen. They predicted an overpopulation crisis in the 1960s, mass starvation in the 70s, and an end of oil in the 1990s. These alarmists always demand the same thing: absolute power to dominate, transform, and control every aspect of our lives.
So that was his position. I don't know what you make of that.
It's very interesting, isn't it, Mike? Because just when you get to the point where you think that Trump is completely off the rails, he comes in and what comes out of his mouth makes common sense. What he's talking about is real. We've got special interests. We've got all of these gloom and doom merchants who predicted that we're going to be wiped off the face of the earth. It was HIV at one stage. Everybody, millions of people were going to be dying. And of course, we haven't seen it because it's fake news. And he's highlighting it in front of these very dangerous people who are the special interest group he's talking about.
Right.
But is he just playing to the world stage, or does he actually believe what he's saying?
I think if he's playing to any stage, it's a domestic stage. He's, of course, heading into an election year, and that's a key part of everything that he says, I suppose. But you know, it was a pretty strong message that found itself at 180 degrees to everything else that Greta and Mark Carney and the rest were saying. So we'll see what the response to that is. I know that the BBC did a big section on whether there was any fact in his speech, but anyway,
we'll be coming on to the BBC in a minute.
Yes,
so.
I'm be very interested to see what other people think about the Trump speech. Now, speaking of Trump and the sort of schizophrenia that we've seen in the Trump administration over the last couple of years, where Trump says one thing and the administration does the other or says the other, and over the last couple of UK column news programmes, we've been highlighting the fact that Boris Johnson seems to be heading in the same direction, and we were making the point that there seemed to be no agreement between the joint statements between the UK, France and Germany over the Iran, the JCPOA situation, and what Boris was saying directly by himself to the BBC. Well, here's potentially another example of it, because of course on Monday we were talking about the Iran conference, which was going on in Germany, in Berlin, and while on the sidelines of that, then Boris met with Vladimir Putin, and the UK government statement that came out of that was very, very clear: no normalisation of bilateral arrangements. They said the Prime Minister met President Putin on the margins of the conference. He was clear that there's been no change in the UK's position on Salisbury, which is a reckless use of chemical weapons and a brazen attempt to murder innocent people on UK soil. Boris, said that such an attack must not be repeated. The Prime Minister said that they both had a responsibility to address issues of international security, including Libya, Syria, Iraq and Iran. And the Prime Minister said there would be no normalisation of our bilateral relationship until Russia ends the destabilising activity that threatens the UK and our allies and undermines the safety of our citizens and our collective security. So that seems to be a pretty clear statement. No détente between the UK and Russia.
Well, it would be, Mike, if I could understand
any of it,
anything that was coming out of Boris's mouth.
Well, the interesting thing is that the Russian account of the meeting doesn't seem to tally. So Dmitry Peskov here, he was saying that it was a short meeting, okay, but at the same time quite constructive with elements of conciliatory approach. Let's put it that way, he said. He said that British reports did not convey the atmosphere of the meeting. At least the essence of the contact is clearly different from the essence of the Downing Street report on the conversation. We can state that. We were surprised by commentaries from Downing Street about a meeting of Johnson and Putin. This was another high-level source being reported by TASS. To begin with, it was Johnson himself who was seeking contact with the Russian side. Secondly, his tone was closer to conciliatory. There were no harsh statements whatsoever. Thirdly, the main message of the British Prime Minister was a bid to improve relations with Russia. So again, it's unclear exactly what's going on here. The British government seeming to brief differently to perhaps what actually happened. Well, maybe it was Russian disinformation, maybe the Foreign Office.
TASS, we're not allowed to consider it to be factual at all, according to the BBC, Mike.
Well, absolutely. So who knows? But certainly there seems to be a difference in what actually happened to what was reported by the British government.
Yeah.
And if that was a meeting which was instigated by Boris Johnson, and perhaps that's a positive thing. Maybe perhaps the British government doesn't really want to, just simply doesn't want to present any positive information with respect to Russia at all, no matter what's going on in the back channel.
Yeah, that's the agenda. I found the photograph there so fascinating, Mike, because you look at Putin, who to my mind is looking at Boris Johnson with a sort of mild amusement, and just look at the difference. Putin's there; he's generally immaculately dressed. Boris is there with his scrumpled shirt and his hair all over the place. And you just pick up that Putin is looking at him with mild amusement. He doesn't regard this man as being a serious politician, which of course he's not.
Right. Well, if you like what the UK Column does and you'd like to support us, then please head over to ukcolumn.org/community, where there are options to help us out there.
Indeed. Well, let's come up with the subject of Stefan Sutherland. Now, this was some excellent investigative work done by our own David Scott of the UK Column back in 2017, the tragic death of this young man that relatives and friends said was absolutely not investigated properly. And as time went on, things seemed to get darker as people began to point a finger at Police Scotland, saying they weren't investigating properly. And in the end, it was almost as if the police were saying, we don't want to investigate this. We think it was suicide, really, or certainly an unexplained death. So I'm just going to put the big banner up there that UK Column really got stuck into this one, including meeting Stefan's close family and coming to the conclusion that something very nasty was going on. Well, we've got to say there's been some really good reports that have come out in the last few days, because apparently Police Scotland are going to put a 15-officer team into Libster to reinvestigate, and they're even going to have a caravan in a public location so that people can drop in to give evidence and report to the police. And this needs to happen because if we take this report from the Press and Journal back in 2019, December 2019, they were carrying the story not only about the number of witnesses the police had failed to speak to, but also the fact that witnesses were saying the police were more or less listening to what they had to say and then saying, we don't want to hear that, we want to hear this. So it seems that something very special has been happening in the background. A lot of pressure has come on this case. Have we had a hand in getting that new investigation? I have to say, I think we have. And also, this is a classic example of why one single police force for the whole of Scotland is so dangerous, because there's no proper separation of the powers. And when there is a complaint made against the police, of course, it's that police force investigating itself. But these are officers brought in from different areas to investigate the Libster case, and we will now wait to see what happens.
Now, if you think back to 2015 and 2016, if you remember, David Cameron was running around the EU, speaking to all the various heads of state of all the other member states, wanting to renegotiate Britain's relationship with the EU, produced a white paper called The Best of Both Worlds, which was all about Britain's new relationship within a reformed European Union. And the whole reform issue has been of the EU has been on the cards since then. We've heard Guy Verhofstadt talking about it when he was speaking at the Liberal Democrat conference. Well, this reform agenda has now taken shape in the form of this Europe Day on the 9th of May. Now, this was announced today, and it's entitled Shaping the Conference on the Future of Europe. So, the European Parliament utterly divided about this. They basically, in general, are saying it doesn't go nearly far enough. So this is going to be a 2-year process of what's being described as town hall style debates, and they're hoping to reinvigorate the EU and people's love of the EU following Brexit, because this has introduced some doubts into some people's minds on the continent, apparently. Guy Verhofstadt is going to lead this process, and The Commission, the European Commission, has said that it should be all about reaching out to the silent majority of Europeans, empowering them with giving them the space to speak up, and they're saying that this is essential for European democracy. Now, many people would say that the terms EU and democracy are mutually exclusive, but nonetheless, the criticism from the European Parliament was, in general, that it wasn't very ambitious, it wasn't very clear, it wasn't very outspoken, and it wasn't addressing what should be coming out of the conference. This is the document that they're talking about. And, well, the Green MEP, Daniel Front, said, I expected clear commitment from the Commission to treaty changes, so that he's calling for changes to the actual treaties. There was another voice in the European Parliament which perhaps was speaking with a bit more sanity, and that was Gunnar Beck. Now, I appreciate that Gunnar Beck is from Alternative for Deutschland, and some people may not particularly like that party or where they stand, but nonetheless, just have a listen to this and decide for yourselves whether he has a point.
The Commission President now proposes a conference on the future of Europe to make the EU more democratic. She mentions an economy for the people, yet also proposes more taxes and an EU Green Deal for €1 trillion plus, when EU influence on world climate is minimal. EU democracy is democracy neither for nor by the European peoples. Sigmund Freud spoke of Flucht in die Krankheit, or escape into illness, to describe a neurotic avoidance of an unsatisfactory reality. Rather than face the struggle to regain health, the neurotic patient is secretly desiring to remain ill. Is there a better diagnosis of the EU today? Faced with a menacing economic truth, the EU Commission is reaching for a narcotic overdose of EU integration to take an extended holiday from reality.
Now, the speaker in the European Parliament was not terribly impressed with that speech, as you would imagine. I'm not sure whether Gunnar Beck is attempting to take over from Nigel Farage as the centre of parliamentary hatred, but nonetheless, I think some of the things he said there were bang on the money.
Well, I found it fascinating, Mike, that you could hear laughter in the background, and I don't remember somebody, even if they were really challenging the regime, of hearing laughter. So he was using black humour to great effect to take that organisation apart, and people were laughing. I think that's an important breakthrough.
Well, absolutely, but of course his key point is that the reform that the EU is aiming towards is greater and greater integration, moving towards a more and more federal structure, so clearly many of his colleagues in the European Parliament feel that they're not going far enough and fast enough. They're following the Guy Verhofstadt line. He is trying to say, look, this is nuts.
Madness.
Yeah, absolute madness. Well, our opinion is that, of course, indeed it is. Well, leave people to decide for themselves. Now, let's come back to the UK then, and online harms. Now, of course, we know that the online harms white paper that was published last year has been listed in the Queen's speech as becoming legislation in this parliamentary session. Well, the Information Commissioner has published this age-appropriate design, a code of practice for online services, and this final version is, as it says there, is to be laid before Parliament. Now, this is a set of 15 standards, which you might say are interim steps before the full legislation comes out later on in the year. A set of 15 standards that online services should meet to protect children's privacy. So the code sets out the standards expected of those responsible for designing, developing, or providing online services like apps, connected toys, social media platforms, online games, educational websites, and streaming services. It covers services likely to be accessed by children and which process their data. The code is going to require digital services to automatically provide children with a built-in baseline of data protection whenever they download a new app, game, or visit a website. That means that privacy settings should be set to high by default, and nudge techniques should not be used to encourage children to weaken their settings. Location settings that allow the world to see where a child is should also be switched off by default. Data collection and sharing should be minimized, and profiting that can allow children to be served up targeted content should also be switched off by default. Now, this is interesting enough as far as it goes. This is what Elizabeth Denham, the Information Commissioner, had to say. There are laws to protect children in the real world. We need our laws to protect children in the digital world too. Okay, that's fair enough. But what I thought was interesting about this, Brian, is that the standards of this code are rooted in the General Data Protection Regulation, that's the GDPR, and the code was introduced by the Data Protection Act 2018. The Secretary of State will now need to lay the code before Parliament for its approval as soon as possible. But before that, the government intends to notify the European Commission of the code under the requirements of the Technical Standards and Regulations Directive 2015/1535/EU and observe the resultant 3-month standstill period. So what we have here is some proposals from the Information Commissioner which will go before Parliament, will be voted on by Parliament, but they are based on the GDPR, which of course is a European directive, but that's fair enough, I suppose, as far as it goes, because we signed up to that while we were still members of the European Union. Yeah. But we're leaving the European Union on the 31st of January, or so we're told. But nonetheless, we are going to be communicating with the European Commission about what this is and what it does. And we're going to be observing the 3-month standstill period that's defined as in the European legislation. So therefore, we're keeping our systems in sync with the EU. We're following the EU procedures, well, this seems to demonstrate what we were saying about the need for the UK and the EU to stay in sync until such times as we have the future relationship at least nailed down. Well, you know, anybody that thought that we were actually leaving on the 31st, therefore, was sadly mistaken.
Very mistaken. Somebody said in our chat box, you mean we have to track everything you're doing to protect the children, which I think is a very interesting question, because certainly in UK, we know the government is absolutely not protecting the physical well-being of children. The abuse continues, the cover-ups continue. We get no proper outcome on how we're going to stop the abuse of children. But online, we suddenly have this massive attention and effort to stop children getting into bad areas of the internet.
Well, that's right. And Elizabeth Denham went on to say, in an age when children learn how to use an iPad before they ride a bike, it's right that organisations designing and developing online services do so with the best interests of children in mind. Children's privacy must not be traded in the chase for profit. I'm sure there are quite a number of adults that feel the same about them. You know, the question is why this is special legislation for children. It seems that humankind as a whole is being exploited by the people that are tracking behaviours on the internet, and
the government are part of that, of course.
Absolutely, but this is not necessarily beneficial to anybody. Never mind, you know. I mean, children need to be protected, but actually quite a lot of adults need to be protected from this as well.
Indeed. So let's switch back to the BBC, and just a phenomenal article by the BBC, what happens when we're too old to be useful? And I've got quite a lot of material to do with this article, because I think we, the public, really need to understand what the BBC is into here. But I'm going to ask the question, is the BBC seeding the idea of a final solution for old people past their use? And if you think that's a little bit strong, let's work our way through and see what is in this article. Now, the journalist is Tim Harford. He's a BBC journalist, but he's an economic expert. He gives talks. And it's a long article. I've taken quite a lot of the material because the public needs to really understand it. This is how it begins. I customarily killed old women. They all died there by the big river. I didn't used to wait until they were completely dead to bury them. The women were afraid of me, no wonder. That's the account of a man from the Ashe, an indigenous tribe in eastern Paraguay, as told to anthropologist Kim Hill, and Magdalena Hurtado. Grandmothers helped with chores and babysitting, but when they got too old to be useful, you couldn't be sentimental. So the BBC starts, of course, with an image, which is a loving image, an elderly couple looking over the countryside, arms around each other, and then they are into the murder of elderly people. And I think that image and the start of the article very much planned. So what does it go on to say? It says this: brutally, the usual method was an axe to the head. For the old men, Ashen custom dictated a different fate. They were sent away and told never to return. What obligations do we owe to our elders? It's a question as old as humankind, and the answers have varied widely, at least if surviving traditional societies are any guide. So into people's head, we're drifting the idea that maybe killing elderly people because they're a burden on society is the way to go. Let's follow it through. As another anthropologist, Jared Diamond, points out, the Ashe are hardly outliers amongst the Kulong in Papua New Guinea. When a woman's husband died, it was her son's solemn duty to strangle her. In the Arctic, the Chukchi encouraged old people to kill themselves with the promise of rewards in the afterlife. Of course, this article fully available for children of any age, Mike, by the BBC. And he goes on, what does seem common is the expectation that until your body let you down completely, you'd keep working. That's no longer true. Many of us expect to reach a certain age, then receive a pension, money from the state or our former employers, not in return for work today, but in recognition of our work in the past. And stay with me. No amount of saving changes the fact we'll always need current workers to generate the wealth to support current pensioners, whether that's through paying taxes, renting properties owned by retirees, or working for companies in which pension funds are the major shareholders. Some think we'll need a more radical shift in our attitudes in old age. There's talk of retirement itself being retired. Is he talking about money, or is he talking about the people in that sentence, I wonder? He goes on, perhaps like our ancestors, we'll be expected to work for as long as we're able, but the varied customs of ancestral society should give us pause, because they appear to have evolved in response to some discomfortingly hard-nosed trade-offs, whether elders could expect lovingly pre-chewed food or an axe by the big river seems to have depended on whether the benefits they offered the tribe outweighed the costs of supporting them. Now, if you get a warm feeling about what this man is talking about, of course, what the BBC did not discuss is the anthropologists themselves. So the first two names here were Kim Hill and Magdalena Hurtado. So I did a little bit of research into them, and the first thing I found for Kim Hill was Indigenous people accusing him of helping to destroy them by saying that none of the hidden tribes should be allowed to remain out of sight. We, the undersigned organisations, wholeheartedly reject the proposal of US anthropologists Robert Walker and Kim Hill to forcibly contact uncontacted tribes. We can't leave these people alone. We've got to get in amongst them. The proposal is both dangerous and illegal, and undermines the rights that Indigenous peoples have fought long and hard for. So this seems to be genuine. You follow it through. You are indeed dealing with people from Indigenous tribes. Great concerns about what's in the mind of Kim Hill, never mind what he's been prepared to give to the BBC. And then if we follow it through, we can come to Professor Anna Magdalena Hurtado. Now, she's part of Arizona State University School of Human Evolution. She's going to help us evolve, Mike, which is good, and change socially. But she's also involved with St. Aidan's College, Durham University. I'd encourage people to freeze this screen and read the details. Some of the newspeak language is basically not understandable. So I'm going to leave you to have a look at that. But this was part of the lecture where it said this: thus, lessons learned from hunter-gatherers may be key to 21st century global health. And now I think we get the idea of where this BBC article is coming from, because of course it's not as simple that the journalist has just written it. He's brought in the thought patterns of these anthropologists working behind the scenes. And what are we going to learn? That the way to solve the pension problem is to put an axe in the head of our elderly people. This is the third of the anthropologists mentioned, Jared Diamond, exceptionally controversial figure, which I'll leave our viewers and listeners to research. But we'll follow it up with an ending here by Tim Harford. He says, today's societies are rich and sedentary by comparison to the Ashe tribe. We can afford the rising cost of pensions if we choose, but there are other differences too. Once we relied on elders to store knowledge and instruct the young. Now knowledge dates quickly, and who needs grandma when we have schools and Wikipedia? Is this why we've got Greta Thunderbird in front of us?
Yes.
Is this why we've got a 17-year-old who knows nothing lecturing on a world stage?
No, well, it is because if you listen to teenagers today, one of the views expressed, I'm talking about school-age teenagers, one of the views expressed, of course, is that their parents and grandparents are stealing their futures. I don't believe it's a coincidence that this article is coming out now, because this is the message which is being pushed into the minds, forcibly pushed into the minds of young people at the moment, that older people are stealing their futures. I think, as I've said, I think I've said it on this program already, if you go back 5-10 years, when we've seen previous attempts to bring the euthanasia programs in, that there's been a pushback from society against that. And I wonder in 20 years' time, when this current generation is getting to decision age, whether they would be maybe perhaps not so willing to push back against that policy.
We must hope so, Mike. But of course, what we're showing here is blatant and vicious propaganda by the BBC. I'll just finish off the bit under the grandma bit. It says, we might hope we're long past the days when levels of respect for old people unconsciously track some balance of costs and benefits. Still, if we believe a dignified old age is right, perhaps we should be saying that as clearly and as often as possible. Now, the theme through this article was to open with elderly people being viciously killed because they're no longer productive, they no longer contribute. That was the routine in indigenous tribes. The underlying message we now know is that we should take the wisdom of those tribes and bring it back into our societies. And so this is some of the most disgusting journalism I think I've ever seen by the BBC, and encourage our viewers and listeners to have a look at the article, judge it for yourselves. But if you feel as upset as we do about this one, take the BBC to task, because as we'll be hearing in a minute, the BBC is crowing about its financial reports for year ending 2019.
Now, one thing that we are pretty careful about, or as careful as we possibly can be, when we produce these programs is copyright. But unfortunately, Monday's UK Column News attracted a copyright strike. So this is what YouTube had to say, copyright claim. So let's have a look at who was making the claim. Well, it was an organization called Passion Distribution. And well, I was particularly surprised by this one because it was the clip that we played out from Question Time, which of course is a BBC program funded by the taxpayer. We were a bit of fair dealing going on there because we took the shortest clip that we could, and we were commenting on the video itself. We believe it was fair use of the content, but nonetheless, in the case of YouTube, it's pointless challenging this particular type of strike. But I was fascinated that the copyright holder was not the BBC. That it was this organisation, Passion Distribution.
Just to clarify, Mike, was not BBC Question Time. Was it Question Time? This one was
This is Question Time, yes, but the copyright owner was not the BBC. So this is Passion Distribution, delightful company. and they do all kinds of stuff. They had a picture of Meghan Markle and Harry on their website for some reason. So what's the reason for this? Well, it turns out that Passion Distribution is owned by this company, and that is Tinopolis, who is an international TV production and distribution group. And it turns out that Tinopolis is the owner of Mentorn, and it's Mentorn that produces Question Time. So apparently it's not a BBC programme at all, it's just played out on the BBC. It's produced by Mentorn, they own the copyright, and that's why we ended up with a strike. I just wanted to highlight that because I'm not certain that people necessarily realise that so much BBC content is produced by commercial organisations.
And it's not openly declared. We're sold that as if it's come from the BBC, but in fact public money is just being given away to this organisation to produce some questionable material, which is why we reported it in the first place. Staying with the BBC, this was another very interesting article, Super Rich Elites Making London Off Limits, and this was just from a few hours ago. Fascinating headline. What's the BBC got to say about this? Well, of course, the BBC doesn't have anything to say about it, as we shall see. London has become the epicentre of the elites in the UK, making it off limits for young people from poorer backgrounds, says a social mobility charity. The Sutton Trust says the high cost of housing has become a social barrier. So this article is put out as if it's BBC News, but it's not. It's free advertising for a charity. But the whole subject is fascinating as we dig into the Sutton Trust. Interesting logo. Let's have a look at what the Trust founder, Sir Peter Lample, says in the BBC article. The idea of going to London to move up in the world has become a myth. He says those that benefit most from opportunities in London were either born there or are economically privileged from other parts of the country. And the report mentioned by the BBC, but which is the Sutton Trust report itself, elites in the UK pulling away. What does that document say? Well, it says a lot, but this is a little bit from it. It highlights the rise of the ultra-rich in London in recent decades with their wealth often deriving from finance and banking. I think that's a little bit of the obvious, but there we are. The study warns of a lack of self-awareness amongst this wealthy elite who would back meritocratic benefits and not see themselves as being particularly advantaged. So this is all very good, but who is actually running the Sutton Trust? Well, you can have a look on their website. Here is Our People, and their bottom left is Sir Peter Lample, chairman and founder. What is his background? Do go and have a look, but we'll summarise it. It's the Sutton Company, but it's also private equity. And correct me if I'm wrong here, Mike, but I think private equity is essential big money and hedge funds and
asset stripping other companies, yes.
Right, okay, so that's interesting. Here's number 2, Tim Bunting, vice chair. Balderton Capital, so he's in with money, previously from Goldman Sachs. So, oh dear, we seem to have found another banker. Here we've got Sir Peter Gershon, fascinating man, encourage people to have a look at the site. He's the chair of the National Grid, but he's also chair of the Aircraft Carrier Alliance, that's building our 2 aircraft carriers. And he's also chair of the Dreadnought Alliance, which is building the new ballistic nuclear submarines, and he previously worked for Tate and Lyle, so he's absolutely at the highest level of the defence industry and government, right at the top. Well, Lady Susan Lample's in there as well. We don't see a picture of her, unfortunately, but her background is very much press and media, 25 years anchor, reporter, producer, ABC, CBS and Fox.
Not British media then?
Not British media, but if you need a helping hand with getting your story out in the BBC, it's probably a good lady to go to. Oliver Quick, what's his background? Oh, it's private equity and venture capital. And then we got Professor Louise Richardson. Well, she's Vice Chancellor of Oxford University, but also involved with the Carnegie Foundation. And she's an expert, supposedly, on international security and terrorism. So these are the people who believe their own reality, believe in meritocracy. They're taking people from lowly starts in life and making them into the very thing that they say we should be stopping.
Right.
So I found this very confusing. But when you got into the education team, it gets better. I just happened to choose Mick Halloran. I'm sure he's a very nice man. But he's involved with credit cards, Capital One UK. But then you see that previously he was a special advisor to the Deputy Prime Minister, the Right Honourable John Prescott. But weren't these the people making the very policies that were bringing these more wealthy banking interests into London in the first place?
Yes.
Indeed they were. So there we are, BBC article. If you take it on face value, it has one meaning, but if you actually look at the little clues in the article, you find that this was another complete spin story by the BBC. So how are their accounts doing? Well, it's good news because the BBC income has dropped 173 million and operating costs go up as it sinks into a 69 million deficit for 2019. Now, that was a very, very quick analysis by our very own David Scott early this morning. We'll be doing more work on this document, which is fascinating. It also includes a review of the spiritual beliefs of BBC staff. I'm not sure whether you get ranked, depending on what belief you've got. Maybe if you're dark arts, you go to the top, and if you're a Muslim or Christian, you get pushed to the bottom, possibly. We'll see. But let's have a look at the sort of material. Well, of course, it's all propaganda about how well the BBC is doing. Number one here, to provide impartial news and information to help people understand and engage with the world around them. Well, we've just shown a bit of that impartial news and information, and it doesn't stand up. And this is what they say about themselves. Today, the BBC provides an unrivaled level of local, regional, national, and international news and current affairs. We remain the most trusted source of news in this country and the most chosen for impartiality. But the news landscape around us has undergone some profound changes in recent years. Trust is at a premium. There's been an increase in skepticism about experts, elites, and institutions. Generational, political, social differences have widened markedly, and our society feels more fragmented and divided. That's largely due to the BBC reporting, of course. Political partisanship has grown, and technology and social media have contributed to a polarisation of our national debate. Fake news has blurred the line between facts and disinformation and undermined faith in traditional media. My goodness, they're running a little bit scared, Mike. And here's politics, because of course they've got three little pie charts saying that if you want to understand politics, then join 70% of young people who come to the BBC to learn what politics is about. And here's our very own question time, which they're parading, but we now know is not even a BBC production. So we're going to label this sickening self-serving rhetoric and propaganda by the BBC. I think there's some cracks in the organisation, Mike. I think we are really starting to see the BBC coming under proper scrutiny. And of course, if enough people take on the BBC, could we be in the happy position where the BBC folds?
Unlikely, but it would be at least a step forward.
Damaged brand, at least.
Well, it'd be a step forward if they no longer receive the licence fee, and they've got to at least operate in a proper competitive market.
Yeah. If you're sitting there thinking, what do we do about this? Well, if you're my age or older, I suggest you start getting on the phone and email and Twitter to take on the BBC as to why they're promoting elderly people getting an axe in their heads to save the state money and pensions. We'll leave it there. Thanks very much for joining us. We'll be back at the same time on Friday. Bye-bye.